Dean Bull, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, you write what I think is the most interesting, one of the most interesting newsletters about sort of the intersection of artificial intelligence and public policy. One of the problems of trying to grapple with AI, whether that is from a perspective of political science, from a perspective of public policy, from a perspective of economics, is just how do you govern something? How do you think about how to influence the development of something? The effects of which are still so radically uncertain. Both because it's still so hard to figure out, for example, whether AI is currently leading to huge job loss among entry-level professionals, or whether actually it's a bust and it's not really having an impact on the economy. And it's over harder to know, 10 years from now, is AI going to look roughly what it looks like today, or is it going to be some form of super intelligence that is just, incredibly able to do things, of its own accord, whether good or bad? How, before we get into some of these sort of questions about how to actually govern AI, like how do you think about, trying to answer some of those questions under these conditions of radical uncertainty?
One of the things I really like about AI is that it is maybe the most general purpose technology that has ever been conceived. Definitely it's a general purpose technology. Maybe it is like truly the most general. I think its competition is electricity. It has this very uncertain capabilities trajectory, very hard to know exactly what the world with it, a world with AI diffused in it well. It's very hard to know, the quote unquote positive vision is very hard to articulate. And it presents such a wide combination, such a wide variety of things that implicate the public interest and public policy, that you kind of end up going to like political theoretic first principles much more than you do like when we're debating like the details of like telecoms policy or like healthcare subsidies or something. Like, Edmund Burke and Friedrich Hayek and philosophers and political theorists, like their work doesn't come up in the same way that it does with AI, because AI is like it is almost in some sense like a literary device for thinking about the future, in addition to being a very real technology. And what should the disposition of government overall be? So my view on this is that, first of all, there are like high level incentives, like very, very deep incentives in our society. One of them is, of course, the market system and the price system, and that structures the incentives of everyone in various ways. Another that's really important, though, on the sort of more protective side, we might say, is liability. We have this system of common law liability that has existed for centuries and that allows for people harmed by someone else, by the actions of someone else, to seek redress in court. Decided by a jury of their peers if they so choose. And those two things in and of themselves are like, they structure the incentives of every actor in our society in ways that are like quite deep and quite useful. And I like to sort of look to those things first and think about, okay, what are those things going to get me? What are they not going to get me? The price system maybe gets you, and like capitalism gets you like aggressive development of the technology. The liability system gets you some harm reduction, and it causes big companies to incorporate, oh well, if this hurts someone, we'll get sued, and so we have to build in safeguards or whatever. You get some of that, and then it's like, all right, we have those two big things. What are the gaps that come in between? And there definitely are going to be gaps, but how do we identify what those gaps will be? Well, we can try to sit around a table in Washington or in Brussels, or for that matter in Beijing, and speculate about what the harms will be that we need laws to address. And we'll do that with varying degrees of success. My personal disposition is that most of the time we will not be very successful at that. Or what we can do is we can basically have fundamentally reactive public policy that basically looks at harms as they emerge and decides ways to deal with them, after they've happened, and passes narrowly tailored laws to avert specific kinds of harms that, for whatever reason, are not adequately addressed by existing law or the liability system. So that's like my very broad impression. Like what I always say is like AI is already regulated in many ways. So let's like rely on the huge base of existing laws that we have before passing a bunch of new stuff that's speculative. Because we're usually wrong in our speculations. Even the smartest of us, maybe especially the smartest of us, have this tendency to be like quite wrong about things. Like the EU AI Act doesn't talk about a lot of the things that people are actually worried about with AI today, like in the American electorate. None of the regulations from a year or two ago actually address those things like at all. So yeah, it's all. I think it's all like very. I'm basically articulating here some combination of like a Burkean view and a classical liberal view. So like a traditional conservative view, but also a classical liberal view about being like very open to change, which maybe Burke is not. So that's basically how I think about it.
So there's a lot of things that are interesting in there, and I want to drill down into some of them in a moment. But let's stay for a moment at this philosophical level, because there's something sort of surprising about invoking, whether it is the classical liberal thinkers or perhaps particularly something like Edmund Burke, in the discussion of this 21st century cutting-edge technology that is going to sort of transform the world. And you've written in a number of ways about how conservative thinkers, whether it's Burke or Oakeshott and others, can sort of help give us the right kind of orientation towards this. I think the point that you've just made that is obviously right is that your general conception of politics and of the good governance of society is going to give you instincts about how to react to artificial intelligence. And so there's going to be some people in a more European statist tradition who think there's a new thing happening, it has lots of potential benefits, perhaps, but also lots of potential risks. Let's just pass a bunch of regulations that really go heavy on sort of, reining in the risks, right? The role of the state is to protect its citizens from harm. It's to govern the economy and to make sure that there's a kind of primacy of our collective will over the private economy. So let's really lean towards trying to figure out the ways where we're gonna minimize the potential harm and sort of become master of this, right? Then there's a sort of very different kind of set of attitudes that I think listeners to this podcast will also instinctively understand, whether they agree with it or not, which is sort of more libertarian, right? People just should have the freedom to do whatever they want, unless or until there's very clear, proof of harm. And so until we actually see AI doing really terrible things, we should really be on the light side of the regulation towards it. It seems to me that the conservative thinkers, have more of an attitude towards continuity and change. Where they think that, there's lots of elements of our society that work for reasons we don't fully understand. We want to make sure that we don't impose a huge rational design on the world in a way that might stop those things from working, and that includes, those forms of regulation that something like the EU might be tempted to pass. But at the same time, we also do want to ensure that change doesn't engulf everything. That we don't perhaps have this libertarian instincts that say, let's just see what happens. If there is a potential risk of AI just completely transforming society in such a rapid way that we can't keep track of that, but perhaps there's a reason to sort of slow that down a little bit. So tell us about, when you invoke Burke, you invoke Oakeshott, what kind of sensibility do you think that should give us about how to respond to this, potentially revolutionary technology that is spreading at, incredible speeds throughout society, and has the potential of, leading to, a degree of change and upheaval not experienced since, the first large-scale factories in Manchester in the, early 19th century, and perhaps not even then. Yes,
right. No, I mean, I think this is the fundamental tension, and it's a tension that exists in my own writing, right? Because it's a tension in how I think. There's one part of me that is intrinsically skeptical of change. I like I like things about my life the way they are. I have what Michael Oakeshott would have called a disposition to be conservative, particularly with respect to what government does. And the reason I am about what government does is because ultimately, conservatism is this kind of beautiful and ultimately tragic philosophy, and I say tragic in the sense that conservatism done right, I think, is not about resisting change. It is about a disposition toward change and a way of reconciling yourself to the dynamism of reality. And then, of course, there is a more libertarian or classical liberal impulse which says like that dynamism is often good, which is also true, though it's not always true. So like one thing that I think that I ultimately come down on is what's worse than creative destruction has its problems, right? I mean, the word is destruction. It's not fun to be destructed, even if it's creatively. But like stagnation is worse. Stagnation is much closer to death. And at least from creative destruction, new things can be born. And birth is the thing that we should want things to be born, and we should want growth. Those things are healthier and better from all dispositions. They're like morally better, I would say. And stagnation is the worst possible thing, and is an inevitable outcome of stagnation is gradual death. So what regulation does is it can freeze things in place, it can create red tape, but inside of every law that is written about AI is a complex of implicit and explicit assumptions about what AI is, what kind of a thing it is, what kind of a role it will play in our society, and like what is even technologically possible. Right, there are just all these assumptions, unstated and stated, that I think AI will itself combust. And so what concerns me very much is that we will pass all these laws that will freeze in place a status quo with which, I think if we're honest with ourselves, I don't know that many people who are satisfied with the current status quo in Western civilization, right? Like, I think everyone is of the opinion that something's got to change, and we have different intuitions about what. But, I think about this, to use a specific example, 5 years ago in 2020 during the pandemic, a lot of Americans, and especially a lot of conservatives, got kind of like outraged by, when their kids came home and they were on Zoom class, and they heard what the schools were teaching their kids, they got kind of outraged. And they said, we urgently need reform in the education system. Oh my gosh, this is horrible. And then a couple of years later, a technology comes around that has like obvious, profound implications for the institution of the schoolhouse and the institution of education. And all of a sudden, but also I think creates like huge new opportunities in education. And all of a sudden, the mentality from, again, especially conservatives, but a lot of people other than beyond conservatives, is like, this technology is such an imposition. Why do we have to accommodate all this change just for this technology? And it's like, well, I thought change was what you wanted. So there's this tension all the time in I think a lot of popular discourse about AI, where all of a sudden AI puts us in this posture of defending these institutions, which I think, again, if we're all being honest with ourselves, we're showing their age for most of my lifetime, and I'm 33.
Well, I mean, there's a broader issue that I think is confusing a lot of politics at the moment, which is that, it probably never was true that progressives wanted history to speed up and conservatives wanted to stand atop, history and yell stop. But there was something to that. I think today, in many respects, the roles have reversed. A big part of the Republican coalition today is sort of accelerationist and wants to go all out on innovation and change. And I don't know if that's the dominant faction, but it's a significant faction. And a significant faction of the left today is people who just instinctively are against any form of change. I'm really struck by the fact that one of the most viral essays about AI on the left was this piece by Judd Tolentino in The New Yorker, which I mentioned in a piece I wrote about this. To my ears, she just sounds like a kind of like 19th century priest denouncing the evils of trains before going on to say, I've never used AI. Trains are evil, but of course I would never ride on one. And and I think, again, I don't know if that's the dominant faction of the left, but there is this kind of, really deeply entrenched, small c conservative instinct on the left of, if it's change, then it must be bad, and let's somehow stop it, even as the left often criticizes the status quo as being very negative. Perhaps let's make this a little bit more concrete, because I think that I still struggle to get my head around different kind of options for how to regulate things, and what the actual proposals are on the table. And you really know this in quite a lot of detail. So it sounds like you're quite critical of what the European Union laws and regulations about this are going to be. My understanding is that some of these laws have been suspended for at least a year, but they're going to be implemented at some point, at least supposedly. What assumptions about AI and about the right way to governing it do you think are implicit in the set of rules that the EU has passed? What actual rules are at stake here, and why do you think that they are a mistake?
So it's a fantastic question. The AI Act has kind of two. You can conceptually divide it into two halves. One is regulations put upon developers of AI systems, and another is regulations that are placed principally upon deployers of AI systems in quote unquote high risk contexts, which would be like governments and financial institutions and healthcare and things, education, things like this. Some of the most vital sectors in our society, maybe some of the ones most in need of some institutional dynamism. The AI Act perfectly exemplifies the assumptions thing, because most of the text of the AI Act was written in the early 2020s prior to ChatGPT. And so the assumption of what AI was at that time was that the AI systems that predominated at that time were principally basically narrow machine learning based systems that would, like, for example, computer vision used for facial recognition, but that's all it can do is facial recognition. Or, I'm gonna have a camera on the bottom of my tractor that's gonna look at images of crops for defects in the crops, but that's all it can do. It can't do anything else. And so I think, and maybe even most famously, there are like algorithms to you might take a loan application and process them through a machine learning system, basically a statistical model based upon the previous loan data that financial institution had, and then make a prediction about whether this person's going to pay back their loan based on the historical data, and then decide whether or not to issue the loan based on that, often with human review. So the interest was in regulating systems like this. And there's a couple of things about that. First of all, it's like mostly regulated institutions that are doing that kind of thing. Like I myself, in that world where that's what AI is, I as a consumer, I'm not going to use AI. AI will actually be used on me, is the model. And it's an already regulated institution that is presumably working with contractors, assembling data sets. That sounds like it probably costs a lot of money and takes time. So maybe the marginal increase in paperwork is not actually that significant compared to what they were already going to do anyway, and cost, etc. I think that's debatable, but you could at least have that intuition. And then finally, maybe also it's the case that that bank's historical loan data has real biases in it. Maybe there was a period in the US context, maybe there was a period where it was de facto or de jure illegal for certain kinds of demographic groups to even get a loan. And so that might bias the data. And if you just purely take the historical data and put it into a machine learning system, that machine learning system may well be unjustly biased against certain demographic groups. I think that there is a fair argument to be made. Obviously, you can also get into disparate impact arguments where it kind of turns into race Bolshevism, where everyone has to be treated equally about everything, and that's also a problem. But I think there's a nut of a legitimate critique there. And then, of course, right at the end of the AI Act, final months, final innings of the AI Act's legislative process, comes the generalist language models, ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, etc. These are totally different, right? Is bias an issue in these things? Yes, but anyone can use them. They're adoptable extremely quickly by both enterprises and consumers. And there's this whole issue of one of the fundamental constructs in the AI Act is this notion of the consequential decision. When you make a consequential decision, that is a highly regulated moment. But with a language model, which is like structuring your information environment in all these subtle ways and like doing research for you and writing software, you're writing code, and it's a general intelligence.
Right. The idea of a consequential decision is sort of like you're an insurer and you're deciding whether or not to accept this person for insurance. And that moment is the consequential decision. And if you want to outsource this so that human beings don't reveal the files, you have an automated system that you have programmed especially for this, then it's very clear what that what that consequential decision is, right?
Correct.
If, in fact, you now incorporate ChatGPT or whichever AI model into all kinds of business processes, where does the consequential decision start and stop? And if this regulation suddenly applies to all of those business practices, then you're basically just making it impossible to use AI.
Yeah, like to a first approximation, the insurance company has one use of that narrow system, which is to review the application and provide a recommended decision. In the case of a language model, an insurance company might have 10,000 uses of the same neural network. So this is exactly, what I'm referring to, where like there's just this complex of assumptions that just ended up being wrong. And now we kind of have to like live with that, we have to live with the consequences of that. So that's a great example of what I worry about. And we've witnessed that play out in half a decade, right? It took 3 years, really. It took 3 years for us to go from the framework that the Europeans had to like the generalist models completely obviating it. I bet you a lot of the laws we think of today will be obviated by something that comes down the road for which we don't yet have a word.
Now, when you say that we have to live with those consequences, I have a question sort of somewhat narrowly about the European Union, but I've been in a number of debates about this in Europe and would love your view on this. Europe really now believes in the idea of a Brussels effect, that because Europe is a very significant market, when they pass certain rules and regulations about, for example, the fuel efficiency of cars, that ends up constraining even what Ford does in the United States, because they can't afford not to produce for the European market, and it isn't really worth it producing two completely different sets of cars for the US and Europe. And so therefore a rule passed in Brussels can in fact transform the car industry even outside of Europe. And they have now applied this idea to AI and really think that Brussels is able to steer the development of these frontier AI models, which to a close approximation, do not happen in Europe at all. They happen mostly in Silicon Valley and to some extent in China and perhaps a few other places, but there's really not many significant AI players at all in Europe at the moment. But because ChatGPT is going to want to sell its products in the EU, perhaps it somehow really constrains OpenAI and how it produces those frontier AI models. Now, I have a few things to say about this. Somebody who's both a US and a German passport. The first is that it just seems to me like an incredibly low level of ambition for Europe to say, fine, we're not going to be players in the development of the most consequential technology of the 21st century, but we're going to be able to regulate it. I mean, it just seems like a somewhat sad ambition. But the second question is, when I think about what the real risks of AI are, some terrorist being able to design a biological weapon that kills, millions or tens or hundreds or perhaps of million people, or perhaps billions of people. Complete change in military technology where autonomous drones just transform modern warfare and perhaps change the trade-off between offense and defense in such a way, the balance between offense and defense in such a way that it just becomes much more enticing to start wars. Up to just a huge percentage of the middle class losing their jobs because AI just becomes better able than most human beings at doing white-collar jobs and perhaps eventually blue-collar jobs once we've developed more skilled embodied AI. Up to the existential risk of perhaps some AI model that's misaligned becomes so super intelligent that it just, runs over humanity. It's just none of these things are going to stop at the border of Europe, right? It just seems absolutely naive to me to think that any of those four developments will somehow not happen in Europe, because at the European border suddenly the European AI Act comes into play. On the other hand, it sounded from what you were saying, we now have to live with the consequences of the European Union AI Act from an American perspective. So, how relevant or irrelevant are those EU rules to the CEOs you talk to in Silicon Valley? Are they a little bit of a headache that might make it harder to monetize some products in the short run, or does the EU actually have some power to influence the trajectory of that technology?
Well, I think we're at an interesting turning point right now, because I think the Europeans have really backed down from the posture that they had toward regulation even just 2 or 3 years ago. So in fact, like as I speak to you right now, I am at the office of the delegation of German industry and commerce in DC. I was speaking at an event with a bunch of sort of U.S. German business type interests. And, I think the posture really has changed, and the Europeans have realized that they need to soften some things. In particular, with respect to the AI Act, there are rules on AI development. Most of those rules are actually, like, they gave themselves enough leeway in the text of the AI Act that the implementation has been considerably softer than I might have predicted 2 or 3 years ago when the law was first drafted. That being said, like, I think it is a real concern for industry because we don't know where those rules are going to develop. And yeah, it's also like, I think it's a concern for both Europe and America that most of the rules I mentioned were the rules about deployers. Those are regulations, they're regulations of any company with operations in Europe. So any European country, but also any, multinational company. And that mostly is bad for their economy. Like, if there's some multinational American firm that has a big research presence in Europe, but also a big research presence in the United States, and like that's also being coupled with like, well, there's all this tariffs and there's this build stuff here, and we want to want to show the Trump administration that we're building in America. There's all those incentives, and then it's also like, oh, the Europeans also have these laws that like make a lot of my fundamental work harder. My adoption of AI is much harder in Europe. Like, maybe on the margin you start relocating facilities and relocating people, and that's in the short term that's great for America, but in the long term, it's not so great for either Europe or America, because I think America does fundamentally depend upon like a strong Europe. We don't depend upon it, but I think we will be weaker without a strong Europe. Let me put it that way. So yeah, I mean, but also, to your point about the catastrophic risk, like, that's one thing I didn't mention when it comes to my disposition toward how we govern AI. But like, in some sense, government is just it is this big, risk management type of enterprise, and like. Tail risks, catastrophic tail events, unlikely events with very, very high cost, are the kind of things that the sort of market-based systems, the two incentives that I talked about were market incentives and liability. And liability in many ways modern liability is inspired by market-based systems. In some ways, imperfectly so, but nonetheless inspired. Market-based systems do tend to be subpar in the management of catastrophic tail events in particular. So from a technocratic perspective, this is the area where proactive regulation of certain kinds, or at least proactive steps taken by government, can make a lot of sense. And so this is why, I have been supportive of things like SB 53 in California, which are light touch. I think even if there's room for government involvement, it doesn't mean the government should be unrestrained. It's a light touch bill that requires frontier AI companies only to disclose how they measure and evaluate and mitigate these types of catastrophic risks posed by their models: cyber, autonomy, bio, things like this. And I am supportive of that. If there's a federal standard, I hope that that's something like that at least is in the federal standard. It's worth noting that the EU Code of Practice, it's a lot of things, but one of the things that's in the Code of Practice is stuff pertinent to this too. And so this seems like a good thing to do. And it's one of many things you should do, most of which are non-regulatory in nature, most of which are more like proactive, defensive, and resiliency building. But in fact, I think what the transparency regulation does in this case is it allows us to all get a glimpse of like what are the catastrophic potential risks that are emerging at the frontier, and what kind of resources and steps should we be taking in areas far afield of AI often to mitigate those risks. So I think that's actually quite prudent and is like potentially an area of US and EU collaboration. We'll see.
Well, it's promising that the EU and the US might still be able to collaborate on this or anything else. Let me push you a little bit on how we should think about regulating AI in a better way. So you're saying that the problem with a lot of the approach to regulation is, we see what the technology is right now. Let's make a set of relatively rigid rules around this technology in order to minimize risks and reassert our control over it. But that's really going to start being unhelpful very quickly if 2 or 3 years from now the nature of the technology has changed so much that those rules end up being far too specific to a particular state of a technology, and they either end up being overly constraining or underly constraining or just mistailored for what the state of the world is a few years later. And since it takes a lot of effort and time and so on to change and reform legislation, you're then stuck with a regulatory regime that really doesn't make sense. Now, I have 2 questions. One is, so what's the alternative? I mean, what kind of spirit or approach to regulating AI makes more sense? Just inherently trying to regulate, how AI works when we don't know what this technology is going to look like in 3 years, it's going to be really hard. So what's the alternative? And, in keeping with that, when we think about some of those bigger risks, is any alternative going to work to actually constrain that, right? Unless we're saying, hey, a certain kind of form of capacity we're not allowed to develop or needs to be developed, under very, very strong security regulations, etc. How can we avoid something like, a super intelligent AI we can't control? Is a kind of set of dispositions ever going to be enough to facilitate that?
Yeah. So I think you need to have a system that, first of all, like I said, I think step 1 is probably transparency, because like having information about these, like, I don't know, a lot of things about the world are going to change in 10 years. But like one of the ones that I think probably won't change is that like we probably won't want there to be like, AI engineered pandemics. Like we'll probably still want to avoid those in 10 years, even if many other things are quite different. So, Jeff Bezos always says like the best way to predict the future is to think about what won't change. And that's also the best way to write a law. Try to like write for the evergreen things. So that's one. Another area.
Let's dig down on this, right? So yes, absolutely. I assume that in 10 years, in 100 years, in 1,000 years, we're not going to want, to put technologies in the hands of everybody that make it very easy to cause a pandemic, right?
Yeah.
But then the obvious follow-up question is, okay, so what do we have to do in order to make sure that, the ability of AI to teach people to do things in general, and perhaps to give them knowledge about biology in specific, and even more specifically to actually figure out new DNA sequences or other things that would allow someone with basic skills in laboratory technology to create a really potent bioweapon, that it can't be used for that purpose. But that truly will depend so much on the state of the technology that sort of knowing that we share the goal of let's avoid people being able to engineer these bioweapons is great. But knowing what kind of regulation is necessary in order to carry out the task is much harder. And right, like imagine that AI was so good at inventing really simple lab techniques and so good at inventing technologies that allow me to just like sequence DNA and create a virus, and so good at inventing incredibly deadly viruses that just anybody who has access to an all-purpose chatbot powered by AI would be able to do that. And it turns out that we're just not going to be very good with even basic alignment, so that reliably programming these chatbots to stop people from being able to, from giving that advice to people. Like in that kind of world, we would just have to make sure these AI bots basically don't exist, right? Because the moment they exist, somebody's going to be able to exploit them in such a way that, hundreds of millions of people die. Now, I don't think that's likely to be the state of the technology, right? But the policy approach we should take, including whether it should be pretty permissive or whether it should be incredibly restrictive, surely depends in part on what the state of the technology is. And so how can we pass regulation that is completely agnostic to predicting the future in that way?
Yeah. So it's not about, I would say it's not entirely agnostic because something like SB 53 does specifically talk about bio risk, right? So it's like, this is a risk that the state is now acknowledging. And we're saying you have to there are rules that say if you are developing a model of this size, you have to measure it and you have to tell us how you're mitigating it. And of course, that in and of itself, how a company does that, given that it's now public, that is going to, and how a company does that, by the way, compared to how other companies do it, that will factor in if there's ever liability, if there's ever a legal situation involving something like that, how well they mitigated those risks and what they did and how they measured and all that stuff, the thoroughness with which they did so, they will be compared to their peers. And that is how we will assess a duty of care. The common law can allow that to be dynamic. It's also very possible that the things you need to do to mitigate this kind of a risk, just purely at the AI model developer layer, that they'll change. In fact, I think it's likely that they'll change quite a bit over time. So you want the companies to be incentivized to do a good job in mitigating these things while also not telling them, not being super prescriptive, because your prescriptions might well become outdated soon. So for example, let's say that there are, there's all these safeguards that you can put on the models to prevent them from being jailbroken, to monitor usage. You can have there's a specific kind of set of features of this model that has been activated, and that immediately triggers human review to decide whether, is this a virologist at a university who is doing legitimate scientific work, or is this a potential bioterrorist, right? Things like that you would want to do. And you could see a world where you have technical standards for exactly how reliable those safeguards need to be. And so that's the kind of thing that, or various organizations can be involved in making those. Private organizations, government organizations, the Center for AI Standards and Innovation can do that kind of work plausibly. It can be some hybrid of all those things. Maybe eventually the risks get severe enough that we want there to be something like supervision or auditing that go on, so that it's not just the AI companies sort of grading their own homework, but instead it's there's some either government or blessed by government private actor who is independent and who is sort of making sure, sort of testing their safeguards against some kind of pre-existing spec that is not created by the model development. You could see if the risks develop I'm not confident we need to go in that direction, but that's one direction you could go if the downside risks seem like they're going to become much higher. And then the other thing, though, that I think is important to say is that there's a lot of other things that have to happen downstream for this to go well. One example would be something I worked on when I was in the Trump administration, was something called the Nucleic Acid Synthesis Screening Framework on Biosecurity, where this is a regulation, is a mandatory regulation on the companies that provide nucleic acid synthesis screening services. So if I want to make a virus, I might have its genome and I might send its genome to a company. This is not actually how it works because the technology is not quite there yet, but bear with me. I send a protein, the sequence for a protein or of a genome to a company, and then they will synthesize it for me. You can impose regulations that require those companies that do the synthesis to screen the sequences for pathogenicity and toxicity. We actually already have an early version of these regulations in place. You can have them do KYC so they can make sure, is this a lab? Is this a person in a lab doing legitimate work, just like the AI company? So the AI company
KYC is know your customer.
Know your customer, sorry. The AI company has these safeguards. Then the nucleic acid synthesis company also has these safeguards. And then at the same time, you might also have biosurveillance programs. So we're constantly measuring the wastewater and other things in the environment for novel threats that are emerging. And maybe in the very long term, not the very long term, in AI, very long term is like anything more than 5 years. Like if the AI models are that good at synthesizing, pathogens the way you described, then they're probably also that good at synthesizing treatments for those things. And so, maybe there's a future where we all have little devices, on our bodies that like automatically, like they're connected to the internet and a new pathogen emerges and like every person with that device just automatically gets injected with a cure to it that is like developed by AI and sent down to the device automatically, right? That's the kind of thing that you can imagine in the future.
And given how universal the acceptance of mRNA vaccines was, I'm sure nobody would object to a machine like that. But that's beside the point. I want to ask you about one element of this because you've touched on liability a little bit, and it's I think liability is actually something really important that we don't talk that much about in the broader discourse. I can see how a liability framework can often be more useful than just straight up regulation. But I think it depends on a few boundary constraints, right? So when you have a car company, the risk here is that some design flaw in a car they produce is going to kill some number of people. There's not going to be millions of people, right? But it is, what we consider an unacceptable number of people who die as a direct result of this kind of design flaw. And when that happens, we have liability rules in place, which mean that those customers are going to be able to sue the car companies, and most likely, this should create the economic incentive such that, together with bad publicity and other things, the incentives make it the case such that the car company would, rather spend more money on research and development and safety tests and so on, than to have to pay out those financial fines, than to take that kind of publicity hit, right? But part of this is that there's no catastrophic risk involved here, right? There's obviously catastrophic risk to individual customers, but not at scale. And so that makes it kind of work, right? The problem, I think, comes when, the likelihood of a bad impact for any one company is very low, right? It's very unlikely that any one particular AI lab is going to create, the frontier model that causes the big global pandemic of 2030. That it's going to create this super intelligent AI that kills all of humanity. So they might think, each individual company might think the risk of us doing this is relatively low, well below 1%. We are not going to worry about this too much because most likely this is not going to impact the long-term future of our company, right? But if it happens, then sure, perhaps liability somehow means that this company then goes bankrupt, but the pandemic has already happened, or the super intelligent machine has already killed all of humans. So the fact that this one company ends up going bankrupt really doesn't matter in that grand scheme of things. Now, of course, it may be that if you have 300 companies building AI models at some point, the risk of any of them bringing about this really bad outcome is so low that for each one company, this liability concern is not front of mind. But cumulatively, the risk from those 300 companies is actually very high, or is at least significant. And in that kind of world, you would think that the liability framework really doesn't protect us in the kind of ways we need. So is the liability framework just not well suited to this kind of problem, or do we need to complement it with other kinds of things?
Sorry, so I had my internet drop off, but I got the thrust of your question. So I think I
okay, great, yeah. I can summarize it if you want, but I think you got the basic idea, right?
It was catastrophic risk, right? That was basically catastrophic
right.
risk.
So like,
yeah.
Right, like so, yes. Like if for each individual company, like yes. That's like a sub 1% chance that we go bankrupt because something fucks up hugely. That's not really like the main business concern, but it might be that if 300 companies make that decision, the cumulative risk actually is quite high, and then liability just wouldn't be able to deal with it.
Yeah. it is, in fact, I alluded to earlier the notion that liability is not good at catastrophic tail risk traditionally. That is an area where liability fails. And so that is, for that reason, that is why I specifically concentrate my efforts to develop public policy on those things, because that is what I trust that liability, like I have less trust in liability for that specific area. Couple things I would say. First, I want to complicate it slightly and just say that the liability system does incentivize companies to have like a wide variety of different safeguards and like jailbreak protection methods for things that are like normal consumer harms that would be dealt with by the liability system well. And that work probably is general purpose work that has benefit for the catastrophic risk side. But it is generally true that this is why you need the public policy like to step in here. And so that's why I'm supportive of things like SB 53 in California. It's why I'm supportive of work downstream, for biosecurity, policy in the biotech industry. Mostly those regulations.
And tell listeners who are not as up on this field as you are, what's in something like SB 53, the law in California.
Yeah, so SB 53 is a law passed by the California government that was signed by Governor Newsom in September of this year. So it's a brand new law. Basically, what it says is that if you are a very large AI model developer, basically the top 5 or 6 companies is the way it's designed, you have to publish your what is called the safety and security framework. Every major company already does do this. They go by different names. Anthropic's is called responsible scaling policy. They all have different names. But actually, they already all, for the most part, do this. So this is really just like codifying an existing practice of industry, and that document must contain details about how you measure certain areas of catastrophic risk, including bio, how you what the results of those measurements were, and what you do to mitigate against those risks. So that would be the idea, and also the notion that just in general, like as we move up in different levels of capability, as we go from the models really aren't that much more useful than a Google search would be in terms of bio risk to, well, now the models are like, if you know the right questions to ask, so if you're an expert, you can kind of get the models to be useful to you, to like the models can help a complete novice design a bioweapon. And like we're probably somewhere between the first and the second right now in terms of like they're providing uplift to experts, but not necessarily like it's not like I could go design a bioweapon right now. It's not clear when or if we'll get to that point. But like as we go up to these different scales of capability, then because the thing is these capabilities are also really useful because you can design the same intelligence allows you to design all sorts of novel treatments and drugs. And so like it's like hugely useful, and you don't just want to say you can't do it. It also probably doesn't work. Like to say like a model may not pose bio risk is like not going to be an effective law for any number of reasons. So, but the notion, is contemplated in SB 53 that like as you go up to different like qualitative levels of capability, then different qualitative levels of safeguard are also required, which seems reasonable to me. So I think you do have to take this stuff quite seriously. My view of these issues is that they are quite tractable issues on which we can make a lot of progress. It's not like they're not threats at all. But also, I think that sometimes, particularly early on in the AI safety, like sort of early after ChatGPT, there were AI safety advocates who I think exaggerated how overwhelming these problems really are. My view is like, especially having sat in government, like when you sit in government, a new catastrophic tail risk comes across your desk every single day. And so, you have to, there's no 100% solutions to these things. There are compounding 95% solutions that kind kind of like as I described with the mitigations, that you might do on both biosecurity and the AI model safeguards, and wastewater treatment, biosurveillance, and developing cures more rapidly, doing all those things together. That's the way we deal with these sorts of issues. And, I think they're tractable problems. Do we have a 100% solution? No, but it was never realistic to expect one. So, I think there's tractable problems, but also it's not, that doesn't mean we should relax and not do anything. It's no, there's quite a bit of work to be done, and a lot of it needs to be done with urgency.
So I feel like you've given us a little bit of a sense of how you do want to think about regulating AI, but perhaps you can now, pull those threads together a little bit for listeners. I mean, if you had to answer in kind of 60 seconds, what forms of regulation can help to mitigate some of these very serious risks without slowing down, innovation in AI, that could really have very positive impacts for the world. What, very briefly, give us a list of some of the things we should do and some of the things we shouldn't do.
Well, so, I do think that transparency and facilitating insight about these problems is step number one. And we're kind of in the process of taking that step right now. Another step is to think about, for threat models that we believe are real, it's to kind of examine the downstream, okay, what would we need to do? What would the way I would put this is what's the victory condition here? If we're worried about autonomous cyber attacks, well, we know that autonomous cyber defense is also possible. So what does the world look like? What is the set of policies and institutions and technologies that we need in order for us to feel actually not only are we, we're not just treading water, not only are we mitigating this risk, but we're actually going to get better at cyber defense than we were before. Very similar thing. We know that biosecurity is a problem. We just lived through a multi-year pandemic. So you think about what the victory condition looks like, essentially. And then you build in parallel, you have all of these different societal actors, you're channeling philanthropic resources and government resources and corporate resources, all toward trying to build that institution. And I think, what I view as my role is A, helping to channel those resources, and B, trying to articulate what does that institutional arrangement look like? What is the win condition here, right? Or at least trying to amplify the voices of those who have already articulated such things. You do that, and very frequently, the last thing I will say, and the reason that regulation is very much a double-edged sword, is that all of the things I've mentioned, bio, cyber, and I think even the challenge of AI governance itself, AI is a general purpose technology. It is useful for the defensive side and the resilience side of all of those things. We will not govern AI without AI. That's a weird fact, but it's also kind of trivially obvious if you think about other general purpose technologies. Imagine trying to govern computers without computers. Governing computers with pen and paper doesn't seem like it would work very well. Similar kind of thing. So if you regulate AI too much, not only do you stifle capabilities growth and innovation, but you also stifle often the ability of people in the kinds of critical infrastructure, say. We regulate critical infrastructure a lot, but if we regulate AI use in critical infrastructure because we're worried about AI risks in critical infrastructure, then we also might regulate by accident the ability of critical infrastructure owners to adopt AI in defensive ways that we all want them to. So that is the challenge, that is the balance you have to strike. I don't, unfortunately, I don't have a way of, I'm not a good politician, and I don't have a way that I could summarize all of this in one sentence or two, but that's basically how I think about it.
This starts to get a little bit into another point you've made that I find interesting, which is about how AI is going to transform our institutions. So far, I think this conversation has been quite focused on what regulation is helpful or harmful, what kind of framework to use for regulation. But there is a kind of more fundamental question where our institutions were built in the 18th century, and already there's all kinds of technologies, including just the internet, that I think lead to a little bit of a felt mismatch between our democratic institutions and how people are now used to having an impact on the world. some of the basic assumptions that we can't all come together and decide together and deliberate together are not really true with, Web 1.0 or 2.0 technologies. Now, there's other constraints. I think one of the reasons why actually you don't want direct democracy is that most people just aren't that interested in politics, and that would end up with the people most obsessed with politics, who are often the most ideological, having the biggest voice. There's all kinds of other problems. But there is a kind of fundamental question already about if we really are serious about the project of self-government, why are we self-governing ourselves with 18th century technology rather than using late 20th century, early 21st century technology? You could imagine ways in which artificial intelligence poses the question of how we should radically transform our institutions in quite fundamental ways as well. And part of that may be about the institutions of self-government, right? Like how is it that we can use AI to actually translate popular views into public policies, which I think is kind of one of the core points of a democracy. But also just, how can we just radically change our idea of what the DMV look like? And beyond government, how is it that universities are going to look different, that research labs are going to look different, that corporations are going to produce goods in a different way? There's obviously no firm answers to any of those questions, but how should we think about keeping what's valuable in our institutions, not becoming a weird kind of AI utopian who thinks all these institutions no longer have value because they're somehow going to be replaced by Gemini 3.0 or something, and yet remaining open to intelligent and smart ways to rethink our institutions such that they can seize upon these technologies.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is, in some sense, this to me is the fundamental question. So I wrote a piece a couple of months ago. It was called The Building Company. And it was a speculative sort of short story about a company that has developed the capability to robotically construct buildings, like warehouses and stuff. And you can think about, in that world where that technology exists and it's widely diffused, you can imagine that, there might be something like building, there's building codes in local government that are enforced by departments of buildings, and they send inspectors out periodically to go look at sites, and it's often a very cumbersome process. It can be very expensive. Well, when you have end-to-end autonomy of the construction of a building, well, you can kind of just have the robots, they have all this telemetry data that they're collecting, all this visual data, all this stuff about what they're doing, right? And that is just perfectly encapsulatable information that can be streamed basically in real time to a regulator who can be monitoring constantly with their own AIs for potential, risks, bad practices, whatever else, violations of the code. You can imagine that would change how banks and insurers would think about writing policies for buildings. They would, if they knew everything, if they knew every step that was taken in construction, you can imagine all sorts of changes that would come downstream of that. And you can imagine that mostly being better. Now, you can also imagine that same idea being used to constantly surveil everyone and be sending everything constantly to surveillance, and you get into Skynet. So we have to have a set of principles by which we decide, probably way, way, way more sophisticated than data or private data. We probably need more sophisticated abstractions for thinking about what are the moments when we actually want there to be heavily AI-enabled governance, and what are the areas where we very much don't. And I think the answer will be there will often be very binary decisions where we're no, we do not want AI-enabled governance of that. And some where we were yes, we want to aggressively adopt that. So that would be one thing. I think, you brought up democracy. I think the institution of democracy itself is the kind of thing where it's the notion of going to a polling place and casting a vote on a specific day is a very nice notion. It is also a technologically contingent notion. And maybe there are better ways that are way more profound than I vote online now, that we can use digital technologies to bring the perspective of the public to bear on the creation of public policy and make sure that the public has basically ultimately retains sovereignty over like the direction of things of public interest. Very, very possible, but like, you have to be extremely careful and things like that, of course. And I think like you have to be cognizant. Like I think like you have to have very firm principles, and this is why this is one of the other areas where like AI does go back to being very political theoretic and philosophical in nature, where like you need a really, really robust set of principles to decide like when are we going to do this kind of thing and when are we not, and like what are the things we do want to preserve, because all of a sudden governments will be able to do like much more than they currently can. In some sense, they'll be able to surveil and incorporate much more information than they currently can, and in some ways that will be great, and in some ways that will be very bad. And if we go into it with like mealy-mouthed principles, we'll probably come out with very subpar outcomes. So this is why I think that classical liberalism is so important, and I hope that it has a serious resurgence, not just in America but across the world, because I think it does give us a very like individual liberty preserving, privacy respecting way of thinking about this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, a few thoughts on this kind of reimagination of government. I feel really torn on the subject because, the first thought I have is, yes, of course we should try and figure out ways to do this. It is kind of strange to run our institutions, along a model that was available in the 18th century and that, sidesteps all of these technologies that we can use now. And it's not like we're doing very well at delivering on the basic promise of our political system, right? One of the key promises of our political system is that it is government, by the people, that we are translating popular views into public policies. And most citizens do not feel like that. And that's something that citizens on the left and the right and the center probably have in common. But most of them feel like, those people in Washington are not really listening to me. So of course we should be open to this, right? Now the second point is that any actual set of ideas about how to do that, it's just very easy to pick the holes in. And it's because they usually do have holes. I used to teach a class on democracy in the digital age at Harvard, 10 years ago now. And even then there was these kind of utopian ideas about liquid democracy and different ways to have kind of smart setups to, and like they're kind of cool, like they're fun to talk about. They were a good teaching tool in that class. But like it was kind of obvious that none of them would work, right?
Yeah.
And then the third is that, as you're pointing out, one of the reasons why they don't work are things that actually have quite fundamental reasons that are going to apply at any stage of a technology. One beautiful text from a very different political tradition than yours, but that I think is relevant, was written in the 1960s when there was a huge fashion for basis democracy, for participatory democracy in a kind of somewhat socialist vein, by Michael Walzer in Dissent magazine. And he called it A Day in the Life of a Socialist Citizen. And the idea of the piece was, if we manage to achieve socialism, but we do it in a form of basis participatory democracy, what would the day of the socialist citizen actually look like? And the kind of joke of the piece was that where Marx promised that people would be, fishing in the morning and hunting in the afternoon and being critics in the evening, the day of a socialist citizen in basis democracy would be, sitting on the fishing license committee in the morning and debating laws about hunting in the afternoon and sitting on a literary prize committee in the evening. So actually, it would completely alienate you from the things that this utopian system is supposed to deliver for you, right? The debate today is very different, has very different contours, but I think the basic question of, yes, we have a technology to involve everybody in the design of the details of regulation about AI. And we could have public comment in a much more fluid way, and we could have, if we want, every US citizen voting on this stuff, right? And this is stuff that we could do before AI. We could have done that 10 years ago. But most Americans don't have the interest, don't have the expertise, in participating in this process. And if we open it to everybody, the only people who likely would really participate are special interests, people with extreme ideological views, weirdos, right? Like it would not, in fact, make the system more representative of ordinary citizens. And so some of those constraints on why our political system isn't responsive to popular views in the ways we like it to look like they're technological, but actually ultimately are probably more rooted in, basic facts about human psychology and politics that are unlikely to change.
Yes. No, I mean, completely. And by the way, I myself, any of those kinds, especially to things as fundamental as democracy, any kind of institutional evolution in these fundamental things, like I am my Burkean comes out in it, my inner Burkean comes out in a very strong way. And I'm like quite skeptical and like, oh, I'd like to see a lot more. I'd like to see the technology diffuse and develop in like way, way, way more areas until we even begin to think about things like that. One of the other things here, though, is that, you know, if you think, I really have a quite like biological conception of institutions. And I often use the language of biology in analogical ways to like think about institutional evolution. And I think it is true that like institutions that are insufficiently supple will, in the long run, I mean, we're probably already living through that right now. That is why I think probably the insufficient suppleness of Western governance institutions is probably a big part of why many citizens of Western societies do not feel as though their government represents their interests. And so, you know, what are the institutions that are more capable of evolving and that have been competently, you know, like that are sort of functioning well in our society today? Well, I would argue like probably like big technology companies are a fairly good example of that. Of like, you know, what went right during COVID? Well, we did produce mRNA vaccines that worked. That was controversial, but we did in fact do that. And we were all able to go to remote work, like kind of overnight, massively increasing our usage of cloud computing. And that kind of just worked, you know, like it kind of just happened. And like we owe AWS and Microsoft and Google and other companies, like, you know, basically we owe them thanks for like allowing us to keep our economy afloat during this very fraught time. So like, I guess what I'm saying is that the risk you run of being like highly Burkean with respect to everything that involves the government, sort of creative, transformative adoption of AI in the institutions of governance, is that they just simply don't evolve. And the other, you know, other institutions do. And like, there are things about current big tech companies that are already quasi-governmental in nature. And in some sense, this has been an old feature of America, right? The financial institutions, the banks have quasi-governance aspects to them. There are many private organizations that have quasi-governmental function. So it's not inherently bad that they will, but you can imagine a world if AI really pans out in some of the promises that it has. Like, you can, one of the questions that I think about all the time is like, what kind of an institution is the Frontier Lab, right? Like the Frontier AI Lab, the OpenAI, the Anthropic, the Google DeepMinds of the world. What kind of a thing is this? And like, to what extent and in what ways will it be governmental in nature? And how will that challenge the existing structures of the nation state? Because, I mean, I guess, you know, to put an exclamation point on it, like, I don't think the nation state is necessarily the end of history. Now, the evolution of something like that, even, you know, if AI moves very quickly, will still take decades, if not centuries. But nonetheless, I think we need to be prepared for, like, it might just be a structural reality that the tectonic plates here are moving beneath our feet in such a way that the nation state itself becomes challenged over time. I don't have high confidence in that, but I think it's certainly a plausible possibility.
Dean, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. This was great fun.